Hello, my name's Amy de la Haye. I'm a dress historian, a writer and curator, and a regular contributor to SHOWstudio. I'm here today to interview Charlie Porter about his book, Bring No Clothes, Bloomsbury and the Philosophy of Fashion. He probably needs less introduction, but I'll ask Charlie to introduce himself.
So I'm Charlie Porter. I'm a writer. I was a fashion journalist primarily for 20 odd years, writing for people like the FT and Fantastic Man and The Guardian, and then I started writing books, and so in 2021 I had a book, What Artists Wear, and then this is my new book.
The book is a book about dress, it's a book about undress, it's part autobiographical, also an exploration of stitching to salve grief, and it's also a manifesto. It's a political manifesto about the environment, about power, and about dressed identities. So we have a huge amount to talk about.
We do.
Could you start by telling us, please, a little bit about the background, how this book came about?
Yeah, it's really simple. I was asked to curate an exhibition at Charleston Trust, which is the home that the artists Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant moved to in 1916, I think it was, to become conscientious objectors in the First World War, and it's now preserved as this kind of epicenter of Bloomsbury freedom and vivacity of life. It's down near Lewes in East Sussex, and it does exhibitions as well. And they asked me to curate an exhibition on the clothes that the Bloomsbury group wore, and then also at the same time 21st century responses to the Bloomsbury group in fashion, from people like Kim Jones at Dior, Comme des Garçons, Erdem. The list goes on and on and on. And then so I started my research, and pretty much straight away I was like, okay, there's a book in this too. It's not just an exhibition. The book and the exhibition have the same title. They're both called Bring No Clothes, but they're kind of different. Yeah. They're the same but different. And that was really important to me, that a book can do what a book can do and an exhibition can do what an exhibition can do.
Absolutely. We might describe the Bloomsbury group as anti-fashion.
Right.
And historically, to reject fashion was an incredibly brave stance.
Yeah.
If you rejected fashion, you were risking social ridicule. You could have your life ruined.
Yeah.
So the only people who could adopt that stance were the incredibly wealthy, artists, the aristocracy, and royalty.
Yeah. And
so I wonder if you could say a little bit about Bloomsbury's sort of anti-fashion and privilege.
To me, they were a collective of mostly queer creatives at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And what they did was they moved to this area of London called Bloomsbury, which still today is kind of a bit of a ragtag area. I mean, the house prices there are now sky high, like in all of London, but it is still the area that's just south of train stations. It's a transient area. And so for them then, as young people, moving to this area was really seen as not the thing to do. They, Woolf and Bell, who were sisters, they moved from their very privileged upbringing in Kensington in South London across to Bloomsbury when they were in their 20s. But by doing so, they were escaping a childhood and a young adulthood of abuse, psychological and sexual abuse, by a half-brother of theirs. So this escape to Bloomsbury was an attempt to escape to freedom of living, rather than one where women were forced into this abusive lifestyle. And so what they did was anti-fashion. By rejecting fashion, they rejected the fashion of the time. Woolf talks about not caring about what they wore, which can seem like a offhand comment, but actually was fundamental to the way they were living and what the move allowed them to do, and how it allowed them to enter into gender parity or near gender parity with male friends, in terms of conversation, in terms of ideas, in terms of sharing ideas, in terms of sharing life, in terms of sex, in terms of gender. All these things, they were able to attempt a life of parity.
Because it's probably important to say as well, isn't it, that at that time, fashion was so different from now.
Right,
it really was. You adhered to it, but also for any woman who was certainly middle class, upper middle class, as they were, upwards, social etiquette demanded that you got changed multiple times a day.
Right.
So you would have a morning suit, you might get changed for lunch, you might have an afternoon dress, you'd have a tea dress to relax for an hour or two. you might have an evening gown, you might have a ball gown. So women, it wasn't only the restrictive nature of the dress, it was the fact that, you know, the amount of time they spent, the amount of money they spent, they might have spent change 7 times a day.
Right.
Which I think just for lots of people watching this is sort of unimaginable.
Absolutely unimaginable. And then also what was expected of them when they were wearing certain dresses. So the way they did conversation, or what they said, or how little they said, or waiting for a man to say something to them and they kind of go, oh, you know, like...
Yeah, if you look at etiquette books, it says it's interesting because they advise about dress, but they also advise about posture and demeanour and no jerky movements, and jerky movements are ugly, and that women are meant to move gently, a bit like flowers. And, it's just extraordinary that it's not that much more than 100 years ago, and it's so different.
Which is why I was so fascinated in the book, because I think at this moment where they moved to Bloomsbury is the moment when breaks are being made and changes being made that leads to what we understand as fashion today, but then also things are being embedded in what we understand as fashion today that causes what we can see as problems with fashion today. So if we look at this moment of change and how they changed, we can then maybe start to look at how we live in fashion today. The refusal, the impetus, I don't think there was the language around it then, but I think that refusal has existed within history, and I think it's interesting to find these moments of refusal.
Yeah, certainly within dress history, it's like not unprecedented.
Yeah, totally.
I was also interested, at the moment, especially there's lots of exhibitions on about British fashion. There's the exhibition at Somerset House, at the Design Museum, and there's one at The Hague at the Kunstmuseum called Royals and Rebels. Right,
and it's about to be MoMA is almost a fashion, but about Louise Bourgeois and,
Do you see this dressed expression by the Bloomsbury group as something quintessentially British, entwined with British fashion dress identity?
That is an interesting question, and yes, the answer is yes, because I think also it's connected to empire as well. They were at a time when the empire was reaching its peak and about to have its pin burst in it and it dissipate. I'd have to check the dates, but I think it was in the 1920s that the British Empire covered, it's either a quarter or a fifth of the earth. This huge amount of the planet was controlled by Britain. And by fashion, I mean both what men wore and what women wore. I don't just mean, often fashion is just taken to be the decorative dress that women wear. I mean that in terms of fashion journalism, particularly on newspapers, it's mostly seen as women's wear. But for me, it's all clothes that are worn. And at the time of Bloomsbury in London, the suit is kind of, is coalescing the word? It's kind of coming together, it's revealing itself.
Yeah, tailoring's certainly British, but what about their anti-fashion stance? There's a particular attitude to fashion in Britain, or fashion and dress, sort of antipathetic. In some ways we historically there's a sort of reluctance to rejoice in elite luxury. So we have this slightly puritanical attitude to fashion. And I don't know if Britain was the first country to industrialise, we were the sort of first country to rue the absence of the rural environment, and they were part of that group that kind of went back to the land. And if it was later, I'd think it was part of British art school expression, but obviously it predates that, because I think when, you know, it was only just at that time that women were even allowed to go to art college, wasn't it? I do think it's a peculiarly British thing, and I think it's something that has, although international fashion designers have responded to it, it's something that I think the British psyche has an appreciation for and an understanding of.
Yeah, certainly a lot of the what Woolf writes about clothes, the way that she writes about clothing, and Woolf writes about clothing constantly in her novels, in her diaries, in her letters. It's a constant source of interest to her. But yet it's a constant source of like, why am I interested in this? So it's a constant source of kind of embarrassment almost, or this kind of lack of, the dichotomy of like, why it is that this thing that fascinates me also repels me.
But that's also a very British thing about fashion, and not being able to...
Absolutely.
Like refusing it in a way that in another culture someone else might rejoice it.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's an embarrassment.
Yeah.
And that for a highbrow writer to be interested in fashion in some ways diminishes her.
Exactly. But she, when she's at her kind of the peak of her interest, which is the mid-1920s, she writes this famous passage in her diary where she talks about the Frock Consciousness.
Yes, I love that phrase.
Yeah, it's incredible. And she wants to understand the Frock Consciousness. And she's really looking clear-eyed at why it is we wear what we wear. She wants to get to grips with what is happening in what she calls Frock Consciousness. And there's another, a few days later, she makes another statement about really wanting to understand why it is that she loves clothes but hates fashion. Like and the thing is that it's not just about clothes, because what she's done just before she says this is write Mrs. Dalloway, which is one of her key novels. It was her first kind of breakthrough novel. Before then, she was a noted writer, but it was the first time that she'd done something that broke sentences and broke ideas of what you do in a novel. And Mrs. Dalloway is this story of a society woman in her early 50s, and already by the fact that I have to call her a society woman, it therefore says that the state that her life is in. She's
but that
trapped.
was the term that was used at the time.
Exactly.
Like in the magazines, they had ladies of quality.
Yeah.
And then they might have a picture of an actress who wasn't a lady of quality.
Yeah. But this trap of being a society woman. And basically, Clarissa Dalloway is going to host a party that evening. They live in Westminster. Her husband's an MP. And the whole day is this day of this kind of torture for her of the reality of trying to keep up with her life. And Clarissa Dalloway has a green dress that is torn, that she wants to mend. She decides to mend herself because only she can mend it. She doesn't want to give it to anyone else to do. So it's this super symbolic thing of her own stuckness and her trauma, the tornness of the dress, but only she can fix it. She can't go to anyone else for help.
What you make really clear in your book is how few clothes survive.
Yeah.
And obviously, if they're saying bring no clothes and they didn't wear a lot of clothes, they didn't have a lot of clothes to survive.
Yeah, yeah.
As an aside, I really enjoyed also your measuring of the cabinets.
Oh my God, yeah.
Of the chest of drawers and the wardrobes. But I thought that was such a good point, because it really did show that if you've got a wardrobe that big, that it doesn't contain a lot of clothes.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of clothes didn't survive. And so we have to sort of, as writers, curators, evoke absent dress.
Yeah.
And so could you say something? I'm terribly envious that you had this opportunity to go through all the archives at Charleston. Could you say something about the paper, the use of paper archives, the use of snapshots as evidence,
right.
and what you found at Charleston? And also, where did you go? What was it like? Was everything in archival boxes? Was it stuffed in old boxes? What can you explain the experience of encountering that archive?
It was just the most incredible thing, because it was known. I knew at the beginning there were no clothes. It's known that not much survives. Monk's house, which was Virginia Woolf's home in Rodmell, which is now owned by the National Trust, has got everything that they have online. You can check, and there's a shawl that Lady Ottoline Morrell gave her and a walking stick, and that's it. And that was the thing that thrilled me, was making an exhibition about absence. I wanted to know what was in the archives at Charleston. And I wanted to have this feeling of like turning upside down and shaking it.
Is the archive in the house?
It's in the house, it's in the attic upstairs.
And it's still in that attic?
It's still in the attic upstairs. So basically the top floor used to be the housekeeper's room, Grace Higgins's room. To get up to the archive now, you go up Grace Higgins's staircase. And I was always like, oh my God, this staircase feels like it's going on forever. Like it's this tiny little, very tight and high staircase. And I'd not twigged that it's because it was a double height staircase, because we were going from the ground floor to the second floor, because the
servants can't be seen.
Servants can't be seen in the first floor, in the bedrooms of the people that lived there.
Especially in that house.
Yeah, exactly. So it was only towards the end, only a couple of months ago, that someone said, by offhand, like, oh, that's what's going on. I was like, oh my God, I totally hadn't realised that. So the offices are in Grace Higgins's old quarters, or some of the offices, and then in the attic spaces, which had become Vanessa Bell's studio, there's all the archive in all these archive boxes. Everything is stored, as it should be, but also everything is stored in a state of like, this really needs another 5 decades for someone to really go through it all. And and Charleston Trust receives no regular public funding. It doesn't have huge staff. It has a couple of people who look after the collection brilliantly, but their work a lot of the time is just trying to keep the stuff in the house in good enough condition to not go moldy or preserving stuff. Like, so there were a lot of boxes that I don't think had been open for a good few years.
Is what you discovered in the archive what made you narrate your story around 6 members of the Bloomsbury group, and actually they're much more fashionable servants?
No, it wasn't
at all. Or did you decide before?
It wasn't. That was all decided before. When I write books, I'm very structured in a basic scaffolding. So I knew the 6 protagonists before I began. I wanted to focus on key people. I didn't want it to be a mess of Bloomsbury, because if you do Bloomsbury group, it can be like 1 million people. And all the way through, certainly many people were like, have you looked at this person? Have you looked at that person? And I'd look and check and be like, yeah, it's interesting, but it's not my story. That's their story. They can tell that story themselves.
Very disciplined.
You have to be.
Can you say who the 6 people are?
Oh yeah, sure. So the 6 are Virginia Woolf, the writer, Vanessa Bell, the artist, Duncan Grant, the artist. So those 2 were the 2 that were the key Charleston people. Then E.M Forster, who's a writer who wrote Room with a View. Forster is often seen as like outlier Bloomsbury, but I think that's just because he never had sex with anybody. And I wanted to get away from this kind of need for it to be like gossip web. And then there's the figure called John Maynard Keynes, who's an economist, who I use to look at patriarchy and power and tailoring. And then another outlier figure called Lady Ottoline Morrell, and she was chosen, because I thought I was super interested to explore her world, but also because her garments exist at the Fashion Museum in Bath. So it was a chance to actually have clothes. So
and they've had that collection for ages, and they've bought it at auction. And I've had students, Jill Mellor was one of my students, who told you about the Fortuny.
Right.
Yeah, I think lots of people have wanted to exhibit those clothes for years.
Yeah.
It was a real treat to see them.
It was an absolute thrill, yeah, totally. So the archive research at Charleston was during pandemic still. It was 2021 it began, and then through that last winter of pandemic into when things could open up, when I was really going, seeing stuff for the first time. After that, I would go back for other visits of what I knew was there. So I would be alone often in Vanessa Bell's old painting studio that's got the most amazing windows over the garden at Charleston. But in the freezing cold, I would be they said there's no heating in this bit of the house, wear a lot of layers. So I was there in January, February.
So bring lots of clothes.
Bring lots of clothes, yeah, literally. And I would go through photographs, or I would go through fabrics, or I also went through the entire system of every single artwork they've got to look and see what the clothes were in portraits. And the photographs were fascinating because my books have photographs in them as well, so there was also an ulterior motive to find photographs. The photographs led to many stories being revealed if you read what's being worn in photographs.
Also, they're informal snapshots, aren't they? They're not studio portraits.
Yes, they're family photographs, yeah. And often they're shared between them, so actually the same photograph exists in many different archives, but then also some that aren't in any other archives were there. And then the fabrics were incredible, actually just to kind of feel the fabrics. I don't know, the fabrics didn't in the end play that much role in the book, they did in the exhibition, but just to have a sense of the making, because that's one of the other sides of the book as well, is that I wanted each person to investigate a different side of our relationship with clothing.
I really like that, the way that you hooked onto one thing. And I think that was one of the things that really appealed to me about the book, that, we do know about Vanessa Bell's clothes, but what I really liked was that you honed in on a safety pin.
Right, basically Vanessa Bell made her own clothing, and it's talked about often by Woolf. She describes Bell sitting there sewing, saying nothing, and this kind of silent sewing is seen as a punctuation point to, something she's talking about in a diary. But it's family folklore, or it was told to me that she would safety pin her clothes, and I couldn't find any evidence for it anywhere. Actually, that was one of the reasons to go through all the fabrics, was to see if there was a safety pin attached to anything. I emailed with Virginia Nicholson, who's Vanessa Bell's granddaughter, who's a writer and academic herself, and she said that it's a story passed on through the family, and her mother was a very neat sewer, very fastidious. Her mother co-edited Virginia Woolf's diaries, and she used to make fun of her mother-in-law, which was Vanessa Bell, and the way Vanessa Bell would just pin her garments. And it was fascinating to me, this lack of need to finish a garment properly.
Yeah. It's also how useful oral testimony is.
Right, exactly.
As evidence, and it's no less valid than any other form of evidence.
Yeah.
It's also a form of evidence that actually often tells stories about women's lives.
Right.
In a way that history is called history for a reason.
Yeah.
And
it's
I think it's no less valid than any other form. So I was completely intrigued.
Yeah, and often with garments, with garments and stories that are handed down, or ways of working. During the book, I then realised that I should attempt making my own clothes, because I'd never done it before, and if I was going to write about making clothes and write this chapter encouraging people to make clothes, it seemed really kind of...
It's researcher's practice, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And also it seemed really kind of, I don't know, I had to give it a go, and I just presumed that I would give it a go and just be like, oh my God, this is awful and I can't do it. But I gave it a go and I absolutely loved it. But the important thing for me was that from the beginning of making my own clothes, I never tried to perfectly finish a garment. And that freedom allowed me to make garments. Whereas if I was still trying to follow a pattern and make something that I could now go and sell in a shop, I'd be nowhere, because I don't have that skill. But that's not the skill you need to have to make clothes. And I think that was one of the big revelations to me of the whole project, was that actually the making of garments doesn't need to be the making of shop sale ready garments, retail ready garments.
In the world that you occupy.
In the world, that I can make myself clothes and not care about whether it's perfect for a shop, and just make clothes to see what happens.
I agree. And I think what I liked, like, I've not met you before, but actually I read the book and I felt I knew you a little bit. And you gave away quite a lot. And some of it was quite painful, and I just would like to read a passage that I think hit me deep. You wrote, "So much of this book has been written grieving and making through grief. So much of this book has been written wearing clothes that I made for myself." And historically, stitching has always sort of salved the bereaved. You know, when we look at sort of Victorian mourning samplers, we look at the HIV quilts. Stitching does salve the bereaved. And so it was a part of your professional process, but it was also something that was deeply meaningful.
Yeah, Amy, I'm so grateful for you saying that, because I'd actually not made the link with the HIV quilts, and it was a writing. So basically, what happened was my mum died during the writing and research of the book, and then my dad died during the editing process of the book a year later. And so the book is essentially about grief, and for me, as well as everything else that it's about. The thing about experiencing grief is that it can feel like a tunnel. The thing about writing a book is it can feel like a tunnel. Curating an exhibition can feel like a tunnel. Like you're so,
you're in your own world.
You're in your own world, and it's like wake up in the morning. Right, what am I doing? This. I had no clue in that tunnel that it was a shared experience of making a bereavement. Every fabric I'm wearing today, apart from my socks and this Hanes t-shirt, is all the fabric is from Merchant & Mills.
And we should say that you did make these trousers especially for today.
Yeah, I made them. I finished them this morning. These are special trousers for SHOWstudio. But I went to meet with them to let them know what I'd done, because I hadn't told them when I was ordering that I was actually writing a book. I try and keep things under wraps. I don't, seek. I like to keep my books private until I'm able to release them. And so I started telling them about grieving and making, and my process, why I started making. And they started talking about it being a shared experience. And I was like, and about healing. And I was like, it was like, oh my God, of course it's a shared experience. Of course and they said then they do making courses, and they see the number of people that sign up to do them and that come and say they're grieving, and this will help. This is helping them heal.
Especially, I think it's a solitary activity, but also if you do it with a group in a situation where you might not be able to talk about yourself, if you're focusing upon something you're doing, the words come more easily.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had a terrible year too, so I knitted.
Right.
But I also think writing is a distraction, because people said to me, I was really ill, I don't know how you could keep writing, but I kept saying, but when I write, I disappear for 3 hours, and it makes me forget what's happening.
Yeah.
And I thought about stitching, but as something physical, but I think and the repetitiveness of it, but I hadn't thought that actually your mind, if you take your mind somewhere else, that has a not dissimilar process, and so presumably the writing.
Yeah, it's interesting though. For me, it wasn't taking my mind off. For me, it was being able to be even deeper with, and I like books to involve change, like personal change. I like to come out of a book having in some way changed, because it's a long process. It's a long
really
period.
long process.
And if you're going to put yourself through such a long process, I like to feel like I've gotten something out of it, some form of personal discovery or some sort of change to my life.
I think this brings us on quite nicely to what is unique about clothing as a media. And I teach fashion curation, and I'm always saying to the students, it's very, very specific. And when someone dies, the thing that's hardest to give away is their clothes.
Right. Yeah.
So when I was curator at the V&A, young men with the AIDS crisis, a lot of young men for the first time, it was usually elderly people, would come and give me their loved ones' clothes, and they gave them because they wanted to retain their meaning, but they didn't want someone else to wear them. The other strategy is that you destroy the clothes, which Cecil Beaton found when he did the V&A exhibition. He kept going to people and they kept saying, we burnt them, and I was really interested because I didn't know that you said Vanessa's clothes were burnt.
Vanessa Bell's, yeah. And actually, it wasn't actually known, I think, within the house that this existed. It was, and someone actually said to me that, no, it didn't exist. And then I went to the British Library, and actually anyone can get out Grace Higgins' diaries, and Grace Higgins basically, a few days after Vanessa Bell died, she wrote in her diary, had a bonfire and burnt Mrs. Bell's mattress and lots of her clothes and pillows. And so there was this evidence of why there are no clothes.
Yeah.
Why there is no clothes to study. And then also in the house there are 2 rag rugs.
Yes.
Which are made of, used to be very, very prevalent technique of making rugs from old bits of fabrics, old clothes, which Vanessa Bell had designed and then had made by local villagers who were experts. And the rugs are beautiful, and we have one of the rugs on display at the exhibition
I've seen it,
at Charleston
lovely,
and Lewis. And if you go up close, you can really see like the tweed and the houndstooth and all these different clothes. So this relationship with clothing is very different from our relationship with clothing, which can be now very like, I've bought something from Prada, I can't touch it, or a kind of Real Housewives thing of, oh, I've worn it once for that episode, I can't wear it again. This kind of very weird, like sort of almost like non-relationship with clothes.
We've talked about clothes as being liberating.
Yeah.
And a big section of your book, and I think you're not going to win any friends in Savile Row, is almost anti-tailoring.
But I've never been. The thing about Savile Row and me is that like I've always been fascinated by it, and I've always wanted it to be able to be more what it is. But I've spent 20 years writing about menswear, and all of that time been in opposition to tailoring as it's perceived and understood in terms of those awful words, timeless or classic or these words. Whereas actually, when tailoring, as we understand it, first formed, tailoring was a radical act of engineering and design connected to the times. and connected to how human bodies moved and worked.
And again, very particular human bodies, and you make that very, very clear.
Yeah, very particular
because
human
your
bodies.
objection is, it's not material or stylistic as much, is it? It's about power. And you write, tailoring, for example, carries archetypal meanings of power, authority, masculinity, all meanings generated by prejudiced and myopic views.
Yeah, totally. What's called women's tailoring isn't separate from this because it's a gendered version of male tailoring, but it still is a version of male tailoring, so you can't escape from it.
But it has been liberating for women as a political act to appropriate it, and it's actually quite sad that as a political act, women shouldn't do something distinctive. They should adopt menswear to make status, or to represent themselves.
That's exactly it. That's it. You know, it can be a liberating act, but with a very big glass ceiling, which is that the patriarchal language of tailoring still exists. But Forster was uncomfortable, but kind of revelatory for me because I could explore my own repression of growing up gay in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. Because Forster didn't have sex till he was 37 and lived his life in the trap of tailoring, but also was aware that in his tailoring he could go anywhere and do anything. So it's this weird freedom but also trap, because he couldn't live the life he lived. And I quote from his unpublished memoir that was called Sex, that he added to throughout his life, and he said something about wait, I'm now going to do that thing of trying to find a page and not being able to find it, about how angry he was at the end of his life that this had been his life, that his life had been one where he hadn't been able to do what he wanted to do. Well, here we go. So he wrote in 1963, adding, when I am nearly 85, how annoyed I am with society for wasting my time by making homosexuality illegal, the subterfuges, the self-consciousness that might have been avoided. You know, he says, I am angry, I'm annoyed for my life being wasted, and tailoring plays its part within that.
So it's amazing the multiple stories that you can construct around dress.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And dress as the material object. And what I wanted to ask you was, we've talked about absence dress,
Yeah.
but you had one opportunity, which was with a very different character, was Lady Ottoline Morrell, who was more of a patron than a creative in her own right, who was really rich, supported the Bloomsbury group quite a lot, entertained them, went to elite dressmakers, lived in a big house, which is why her clothes survived. Some people feel really, and I know this as a dress curator, some people feel really a bit spooked out looking at clothes that someone else has worn.
It was actually the first thing, it was the first real research I did for the exhibition. The book was still germinating at that point. I'd got the idea and it was like, oh my God, this is something. You know, it was wild thrill to see those dresses and to see those garments. Lady Ottoline Morrell is cast as this society figure, and that's what she was. She didn't have any other output particularly or work, but she was also wildly intelligent, wildly creative, wildly expressive, and also, as I realised, very clearly queer, and very clearly living a bold, queer, radical life, but one that had been completely quashed and squashed and hidden and locked in a...
Yeah, like so many.
The thing about the story as it all unravelled was that it became so clear how gay male stories are easier to trace, because within society gay men could exist kind of under the surface, but they really existed and they were very open with each other. It was known what was going on.
Yeah, whereas lesbians never existed.
Never existed. And also from a point of authority as well, gay men were legislated against.
Exactly.
And female women weren't until I think around 1920 there was a suggestion to, I'm not quite sure of the facts of that, but certainly gay women were not seen as even existing in society. They didn't exist. So what became clear is that actually you could use the clothing to sit with Lady Ottoline Morrell or sit with Virginia Woolf, rather than tell her story in the way it's normally told, which is in a very historicised way. The clothing allows you to just kind of sit with her for a minute and watch and wait and see what emerges. And the experience for me was a bit like those kind of magic eye things that sometimes, like where there's all these kind of dots or an image that looks like TV interference. But if you stare at it for long enough...
It's called slow looking in the museum world.
But that experience of seeing the clothes was wild in Bath. And it was just the reality of these things, like straight away the conversations are like, oh, that one's got more food down it. Oh, there's a fag burn. Oh, look how dirty that is.
So it's not only the garments, is it? It's not just the design and the materiality, it's the biography of the worn garment.
It's the
and the imprints of wear.
And,
and that's what really excites me. So it's using dress as evidence of life lived.
Exactly. And the dresses were clearly handmade for her by a dressmaker, or many of them that we then discovered actually one was Fortuny, and therefore this really rare, amazing sheer gown. But there were these run of like velvet dresses, all with these sleeves like this. We should say as well that Morel was a human who is described as having strong features, and it's that thing of like, why should someone's face be called? You know, these judgment descriptions we place on people. She was tall and she had strong features, which she exaggerated rather than hiding by having the huge leg and mutton sleeves, and she would wear these kind of square necks and like kind of lace trims, and she was very like, this is who I am.
And by choosing historical clothes with historical influences rather than more modern garments,
right? Yeah,
she's positioning herself as someone arty, as someone who's got
of individuality,
a historical awareness.
Of otherness, really. Yeah, because she could have bought from Chanel, you know, if she chose to. She was in that period, and kind of Chanel is seen as the kind of historical kind of point of like, oh, suddenly everything's modern. You're pretty much.
But it was a very British thing, because quite often when you look at the clothes that were worn by socially privileged people in the UK, where they are a historical family, quite often, where they can buy any clothes in the world, they nearly always will choose the historical revival style, as opposed to the modern style. So like the Messels, for instance, in the late 1930s, looked at the whole neo-romantic revival of crinolines and bustles, as opposed to perhaps looking at Schiaparelli. And again, it's making a statement. You know, it's making a social statement.
I think that the statement that Morel was making with hers was about queerness when she couldn't talk about queerness, which then mirrors Woolf and Woolf's inability to explore her own queerness publicly, openly. And then one of the big mysteries of the book, which actually I worked out pretty much straight away. I'm saying it's a mystery, it plagued me forever. But there's a photograph of Virginia Woolf in British Vogue that was taken in 1924 and was used again in 1925 or 6, I think, where she sat in this dress with these sleeves like this and this neck that's trimmed with lace, and the dress is too big for her. There's this big gap between her skin and the shoulder. You know, it clearly doesn't fit her. And it's also very much against the fashion of the time. So it's this statement that Woolf makes when she first appears in Vogue of not dressing like Vogue. And it's always been described as her mother's dress. And when I wrote my proposal for a book, which is what you do when you get a book edited, get a book commissioned, is you write a proposal first and it's accepted or not accepted. And so I wrote the proposal saying, in this chapter I'll do this, in this chapter I'll do this, and in my proposal I was like, and I'll talk about her mother's dress and what it means that Woolf wore her mother's dress in Vogue. So, you know, I started working on the research, and I always do primary research. I don't ever just assume that what someone else has written is actually true. I always check everyone's sources to see where they found the information from, and I couldn't find any source for it being her mother's dress. But if you type into Google Virginia Woolf mother's dress, all the pictures of it come up. It's like, everyone says it's a mother's dress, it's a mother's dress. And I kept looking, I couldn't find any evidence for it. And then it's like, her mother was the same height as her mother was like 5'7"-ish, her mother was the same body shape as her. You know, her mother wasn't bigger than her to make the dress bigger. Her mother was photographed often by the photographer and artist Julia Margaret Cameron, who was her aunt, and all the dresses she wears in those photos have a covered here, or there is one with a slight gap, but it's got lace underneath, and there's no sign of a dress. I think it was around the time that I went to see the Morel clothes in Bath. It's like, these are Lady Ottoline Morrell's clothes. Come on, this is Ottoline Morrell's dress. It so clearly is. Morel was 6 foot. She was taller. She was bigger, and Morel and Woolf were close. And it's like, oh, let's look at this. And it's like, oh, I think actually they were lovers in some way. And even if they weren't lovers, they were clearly queer comrades.
Your book is a political manifesto. It's a manifesto for change.
Yeah.
We've talked about how it's a manifesto for personal change.
Yeah.
Could you just finish, please, by saying, it's also a manifesto about change within the fashion industry?
Yeah. So basically, the book has got this subtitle, Bloomsbury and the Philosophy of Fashion, which I kind of set myself as a challenge in a way. Philosophy is in the book already because the male friends of Bloomsbury studied philosophy at Cambridge and then came to Bloomsbury and discussed philosophy and within this group of near gender parity. So philosophy is really crucial to the forming of Bloomsbury. I studied philosophy at college, at King's in the early 90s, King's College London. And so philosophy has always been this weird thing in my head that I kind of didn't really do that much of and spent my time doing student journalism. But philosophers like Wittgenstein I've always loved and I've always thought about and have thought about more and more as I've gotten older. And I've also thought a lot about how a philosophy of fashion is seen as the most embarrassing thing, or like because you're meant to be like, oh, it's just fashion, or there's not meant to be a way you can talk about it with your feet on the floor.
Wow,
seriously. But you know what I mean, as in terms of most people when they talk about fashion kind of do it in a way of like, oh, well, it's just fashion. They have to explain why they're doing it. What I said before, this dichotomy between being obsessed with clothes but being embarrassed or kind of hating fashion. And I wanted to see whether I could write a philosophy of fashion that tried to discuss garments that could be a way out of the control of the fashion industry. Because for me, there's a difference between fashion and fashion industry. Fashion is what every human does every day when they put garments on their body. Yeah, exactly, to fashion their body, Yes. And it's not about fashionability, it's not about whether the clothes are fashionable or not, they fashion their body. Fashion industry exploits that fashioning. The book for me itself is all about attempting to try and find a new way of being and a new way of philosophy of fashion, so yeah.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed your book and I really enjoyed talking to you.
I love talking with you, Amy. Thank you so much. Thank you.